Clara Whitmore did not scream. She did not beg. She did not reach for the man's sleeve as he turned his back and walked away from her in front of every soul standing on that mountain platform. She simply pressed her father's old leather suitcase against her chest and breathed. One breath, then another. The letter Edward Caldwell had written her, the letter that had promised her a home, a future, a reason to keep going after everything she had lost, was still folded inside her coat pocket. She could feel it against her ribs, like a wound that hadn't decided whether to heal or kill her. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Every part of Clara's journey is waiting for you. And drop a comment letting us know what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The summer of 1885 had baked the mountains of Colorado Territory into something that looked beautiful from a distance and punished you up close. The air was thin, the light was sharp, and the train platform at Redemption Creek, a town that had named itself after a feeling most of its residents had long since abandoned, smelled of coal dust, horse sweat, and the particular cruelty of people who had gathered to watch something go wrong. Clara Whitmore had been on that train for 4 days. 4 days of hard wooden seats and smoke-blackened windows and the slow, grinding certainty that her life was finally about to change. She had packed everything she owned into one suitcase, her father's suitcase, the one he'd carried through the war and kept under his bed until the day he died. She had sewn 2 dresses, packed her mother's Bible, wrapped her sewing needles in a piece of linen, and tucked Edward Caldwell's letter in the inside pocket of her traveling coat, where she could press her hand against it whenever the doubt came creeping. The doubt came often, but she pressed her hand against the letter and remembered what it said. I require a capable woman of good character who is willing to build a respectable household in the Colorado Territory. I offer security, dignity, and a future. If you are serious about a new beginning, come west. She was serious. She had never been more serious about anything in her life. Clara had spent 6 years being serious. 6 years nursing her father through the illness that finally took him. 6 years making sure her 3 younger siblings had food, schooling, and enough warmth in winter to survive Missouri's worst. 6 years working in the dry goods store from sunup to past sundown, watching her own youth slide past her like water over stone, smooth and unstoppable and gone before she ever thought to reach for it. She was 25 years old, and she felt twice that. But she was not broken. Her mother had always said that Whitmore women bent like river grass, low in the storm, upright when it passed. Clara believed that. She had held on to it through everything. She stepped off that train carrying her father's suitcase and the only future she had left, and she walked toward the man who had promised her both. Edward Caldwell was easy to identify. How was the best-dressed man on the platform? Tall, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, wearing a coat that cost more than Clara made in 3 months at the dry goods store. He stood slightly apart from the crowd with 2 men she assumed were ranch hands, and he watched her approach with an expression she could not immediately read. She would read it soon enough. Mr. Caldwell, she said, stopping in front of him, keeping her voice steady. I'm Clara Whitmore, from Harlow, Missouri. We corresponded by letter. He looked at her, not the way a man looks at a person. The way a man looks at something he ordered from a catalog and realizes, upon opening the parcel, is not what he pictured. His eyes moved from her face to her dress, to her suitcase and back again. The dress was clean. She had pressed it the night before in the last town where the train stopped. But it was cotton, not silk. It was practical, not fashionable. It was the dress of a woman who had worked hard all her life and had not yet been given a reason to own something finer. Edward Caldwell saw all of that in approximately 4 seconds. Miss Whitmore, he said. Just that, just her name, and then a pause that stretched out long enough for several people nearby to look over. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, something colder than panic, something that felt like the last warm coal going out in a fireplace on a January night. A misunderstanding, she repeated. The arrangement. He cleared his throat. I believe I was unclear in my correspondence about my expectations regarding... He paused, and the pause itself was a verdict. Presentation. Social standing. I run a visible household in this community, Miss Whitmore. I have a reputation to consider. I see, Clara said. She did not raise her voice. Her mother had always said that the loudest thing a woman could do was refuse to shrink. You see my dress, Clara said, very quietly. And my suitcase. And you've decided that's everything there is to see. Edward Caldwell's jaw tightened slightly. I think it would be best if you return to Missouri. I'm prepared to purchase your return ticket and offer you a reasonable sum for the inconvenience of the journey. He actually reached into his coat. He pulled out a small fold of bills and held it toward her, on a train platform, in front of a gathering crowd of strangers. He held money out to her like she was a hired hand he was dismissing, not a woman who had crossed 5 states on the strength of his written word. Clara looked at the money. She looked at Edward Caldwell. Keep it, she said. She turned and walked back toward the end of the platform. She did not cry. Her eyes burned. The backs of her knees felt strange, like the bones had gone soft for just a moment. But she walked straight, and she kept her grip on her father's suitcase, and she stared at the far end of the platform, where the mountains rose up against a sky so blue it almost looked like something God had painted on a good day when he wasn't tired. Behind her, she heard murmuring. Who is she? Some woman Caldwell sent for. Sent her packing, looks like. Didn't even take the money. She'll be begging for it by nightfall. Clara reached the far end of the platform and stopped. She set her suitcase down. She put both hands flat against the wooden railing and looked out at those mountains, and she made herself a promise with the same quiet fury that had kept her alive through 6 years of everything the world had thrown at her. She was not going back to Missouri. She was not going back to a life that had already wrung itself dry. She had come west because there was nothing left behind her. And whatever was ahead of her, whatever this place and these mountains and this brutal, beautiful air had to offer, she would find it herself. Without Edward Caldwell's money, without his approval, without any man's permission. She stood there for a long moment, breathing. And that was when she felt it. The awareness of being watched. Not the way the crowd had watched her, with that mixture of pity and entertainment that people reserve for disasters that aren't happening to them. This was different, quieter, the way you feel a fire before you see one. She turned her head slightly. He was standing apart from the rest of them, not in a doorway, not at the edge of the crowd, simply standing in the open, like a man who had never learned the habit of hiding himself in groups. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind that didn't come from boots, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead, and a jaw that looked like it had been put together without any excess material. His coat was worn at the elbows. His hat was pushed back just enough that she could see his eyes. He was looking straight at her, not the way Edward Caldwell had looked at her. Not measuring, not dismissing, just looking. Like she was a person standing at the far end of a platform, and he was trying to decide something. He made his decision. He walked toward her. His steps were unhurried but deliberate, the walk of a man who had covered a lot of difficult ground and had learned that panic was a waste of energy. He stopped about 2 feet from her and took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even. Western in the real sense, not theatrical, not performed, just a voice that had spent a lot of time outdoors and not much time making small talk. "I'm not looking for pity," Clara said immediately. She had not meant to say it quite that directly, but there it was. "I don't have any to offer," he said. "Pity's a waste of everybody's time." That stopped her. She turned to look at him more fully. "Then what do you want?" she asked. "I want to tell you that you don't belong standing at the end of a platform alone," he said. "And I want to ask if you'd be willing to come out to my ranch until you've got a clear head and a plan. Nothing more than that." Clara studied him. Everything in her that had survived 25 years of difficult living was running a rapid, experienced calculation. She had learned to read people quickly because slow reading had consequences. She looked at his hands, calloused, clean. She looked at his eyes, direct, not hungry. She looked at the way he held his hat, and the way he stood, and the way he had walked toward her without the slightest performance about it. "I don't know you," she said. "Samuel Carter," he said. "I run a cattle ranch about 6 miles up into the mountains. I've got a spare room. My cook left 3 weeks ago, and I'm eating terrible food, which I mention not because I want you to cook for me, but because I want you to know the circumstances are honest, and I'm not pretending to have more than I've got." Clara almost said something sharp. Instead, against every instinct that had kept her careful and guarded for 25 years, she almost smiled. "A spare room," she said. "With a lock on the door," he said. "On the inside." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her father's suitcase. 6 miles is a long way," she said. "I've got a wagon," he said. "I'll need to think on the ride." "That's what rides are for," he said. She followed him off the platform and away from the crowd, and away from Edward Caldwell's money still sitting in his fist, and away from every whispered prediction of what would become of a woman abandoned at a train station with nowhere to go. Samuel Carter's wagon was not impressive. It was a working wagon, solid, practical, undecorated. The horse was a bay mare who flicked one ear back when Clara climbed up to the seat, then went back to standing patiently like a creature who had long since made peace with the world. They rode in silence for a while. The mountains came closer as they rose up out of town, the road narrowing, and the air sharpening, and the sky doing something spectacular above the tree line that Clara noticed without letting herself be moved by it yet. She wasn't ready to be moved by beauty. She was still running calculations. "You were at that platform a while," she said finally, "before you came over." "I was," he said. "Why'd you wait?" He was quiet for a moment, the wagon creaking along the mountain road. "Because a person's got a right to their first few minutes of hard news without a stranger walking into it," he said. "I wanted to see how you handled it before I decided whether to say anything." "And how did I handle it?" "You handed it back to him," Samuel said, "without raising your voice." Clara was quiet. "Is that what decided you?" she asked. "That," he said. "And the way you put your hands on that railing and looked at the mountains like they owed you something and you intended to collect." Clara said nothing to that, but she felt something shift inside her. Something small. Something that had been locked tight for a very long time. The ranch appeared gradually. First the fence line, then the outbuildings, then the main house set back against the ridge with the mountains pressing up behind it, like the world had piled everything it had to offer right there in one place. It was not grand. It was not what Edward Caldwell had promised. But it was real, and it was solid. And the moment Clara stepped down from that wagon, she felt the ground under her feet in a way she hadn't felt since before her father got sick. Samuel showed her the spare room without ceremony. It was plain. A bed with a good quilt, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out toward the eastern ridge where the light would come in clean every morning. There was a hook on the wall for hanging clothes, and a small mirror above the dresser that had a crack running diagonally across the lower left corner. "It's not much," Samuel said from the doorway. "It's more than a platform," Clara said. He nodded once. "Supper's what I can manage, which means beans and cornbread. You're welcome to it." "I'll make the cornbread," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "I want to contribute. There's a difference." Something moved through his expression then. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. Like she had said something he understood without having to explain it. "Kitchen's through the main room," he said. "I'll see to the horse." That first evening was quiet in a way Clara hadn't experienced in years. The ranch hands were gone for the day. The house settled around her with the particular patience of old timber. She found the kitchen in better shape than Samuel had suggested, organized, though sparse, and she made the cornbread and reheated the beans and set the table with the plain tin plates she found in the second cabinet. Samuel came in from the barn, smelling of horses and clean hay, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down across from her. They ate. Not in uncomfortable silence. In the kind of silence that two people fall into when they are each busy thinking, and neither one feels the need to fill the air with noise. "How long were you corresponding with Caldwell?" Samuel asked after a while. 4 months, Clara said. He do this often, do you know? Send for women and— I don't know, she said. And I've decided I don't want to spend much energy thinking about Edward Caldwell. Samuel looked at her across the table. Fair enough, he said. Tell me about the ranch, she said. And he did. He told her about the cattle and the water rights and the south pasture that had been giving him trouble with fence lines. He told her about the two hands he had, Hector, who had been with him 5 years, and a younger man named Pete, who was learning. He told her about the winter that hit hard 2 years back and took 3 head of cattle and most of his stored feed and how he'd rebuilt from it. He did not tell her about his wife. Not that night. But Clara noticed the absence of certain things. No woman's touch in the kitchen, no photographs on the walls that included a face he might have explained, a particular careful blankness around the subject of his own history that told her there was something there he wasn't ready to share. She didn't push. She knew about things you weren't ready to share. She helped wash the dishes and then said goodnight and went to her room and sat on the edge of that bed with her father's suitcase on the floor beside her and the mountains going dark outside her window. She had not cried on that platform. She cried now. Not for Edward Caldwell. Not for the humiliation of standing in front of a crowd of strangers while a man decided she wasn't worth the trouble of knowing. She cried for her father, who had believed she deserved better than Harlow, Missouri. She cried for the 6 years she had given to surviving instead of living. She cried for the version of herself she'd left at that train station, the one who had believed so completely in a promise written in ink on a piece of paper. Then she stopped. She dried her face. She unpacked her suitcase with the methodical patience of a woman who had learned that order was a form of courage when everything else felt chaotic. She hung her second dress on the hook. She put her mother's Bible on the windowsill. She arranged her sewing needles in their linen wrap on the top of the dresser. Then she folded Edward Caldwell's letter very carefully and placed it at the very bottom of the empty suitcase. Not because she wanted to remember it, because she had learned, from a lifetime of hard seasons, that you did not throw away the things that hurt you. You put them underneath. You put them where they belonged, below everything you were building next. She climbed into bed and pulled the quilt up and listened to the wind moving through the mountain pines outside, and thought about Samuel Carter's voice when he said, "I wanted to see how you handled it before I decided whether to say anything." She thought about a man who waited, who watched, who made decisions carefully, and then acted on them without performance. She did not know what the next days would bring. She did not know what she was going to do, or how long she could stay, or what a woman who had arrived in Colorado territory with one suitcase and no prospects was supposed to build from the rubble of what Edward Caldwell had done to her plans. But she was not on a train platform. She was not in Missouri. She was in a room with a lock on the inside of the door and a window facing east and a man sleeping somewhere down the hall who had looked at her on that platform, not measuring, not dismissing, and decided she was worth walking toward. That was something. That was, in fact, more than she'd had in a very long time. Down in the bunkhouse at the edge of the property, Hector was telling Pete about the woman the boss had brought home. "Where'd she come from?" Pete asked. "Caldwell left her at the station," Hector said. Pete whistled low. "Caldwell. So she was supposed to—" "Yeah. And Carter just walked up and brought her home," Hector said. "That's what I'm telling you." Pete was quiet for a moment. "Boss ever done anything like that before?" Hector thought about it. "No," he said. "He hasn't." Meanwhile, 6 miles down the mountain road, in the parlor of the finest house in Redemption Creek, Edward Caldwell was listening to his foreman describe what he had seen. "She went with Carter," the foreman said, "climbed right up in his wagon." Edward turned his glass slowly in his hand. Samuel Carter. A man. Edward had written off years ago as a stubborn, undercapitalized rancher clinging to a strip of mountain land that wasn't worth the headache of taking. A man who had resisted every attempt to buy him out with the quiet, infuriating patience of someone who had decided once what he valued and saw no reason to revisit the question. "She left the money," the foreman added. Edward looked up. "She what?" "Left it. Didn't take a cent." Edward set his glass down. I didn't know what that meant yet. But something in him, The part that had spent 30 years measuring everything by its dollar value, felt, for just a moment, deeply and uncomfortably uncertain. The next morning, Clara arose before the sun. Old habit. 6 years of being the first one up in a household that needed managing. She dressed quickly and moved through the dark house to the kitchen and started the fire in the wood stove before Samuel appeared in the doorway, already dressed, hat in hand. He stopped when he saw her. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know," she said, not looking up from the stove. "Coffee?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "Please." He sat down at the table, and she heard something in that single movement, the way a very tired person sits when they've stopped waiting for the morning to be different from every other morning. And she felt, unexpectedly, the particular ache of recognizing loneliness in someone else, because you'd been carrying your own for so long. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. "Tell me what needs doing today," she said. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "What needs doing?" he repeated. "On the ranch," she said. "I'm not going to sit in a room feeling sorry for myself. Tell me what needs doing." Samuel Carter put his coffee cup down, and for the first time in longer than Clara would ever know, the corner of his mouth moved toward something that was almost a smile. "All right," he said. "Here's what needs doing." That was how it started. Not with declarations, not with promises, not with anything written on paper that could be folded up and tucked in a coat pocket and held against the ribs like a wound. Just two people at a kitchen table in the dark mountain morning, with the wood stove warming the room and the coffee growing cooler, and the day beginning to press itself pale and serious against the eastern windows, figuring out what needed to be done. Neither one of them said anything about the future. Neither one of them had to. Clara had been at the ranch for exactly 3 days before she found the ledger. She wasn't snooping. She had been looking for a spare candle in the bottom drawer of the desk in the front room when her hand closed around a cloth-bound book, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. She pulled it out meaning to set it aside, and instead stood there for 30 seconds, reading numbers that made her stomach go cold. The ranch was bleeding money. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a man who had been reckless or foolish, but slowly, steadily, the way a person bleeds from a wound they've decided to ignore because they don't have time to deal with it. The cattle revenues were down. The expenses for feed and winter supplies had crept up over 3 seasons. There were 2 entries in the past 6 months that Clara recognized immediately as payments made under pressure. Not fair market transactions, but the kind of numbers that showed up when someone was being squeezed. She put the ledger back exactly where she found it. She said nothing about it at breakfast. But she watched Samuel Carter more carefully after that. She watched the way he came in from the south pasture that afternoon, with his jaw set and his eyes carrying something behind them that had nothing to do with the cattle or the fence line he'd been repairing. She watched the way he stopped at the edge of the yard and stood for a moment looking toward the road into town, not moving, like a man running through options in his head and not finding one he liked. She watched the way Hector glanced at Pete when Samuel walked past them without his usual word of greeting, and the way Pete looked away quickly, understanding something without being told. That evening, after supper, Clara didn't go to her room. She sat down in the chair across from Samuel's desk and folded her hands in her lap and said, "Tell me about the water." Samuel looked up from the papers in front of him. "Excuse me?" he said. "The water," Clara said again. "The south pasture fence you've been repairing for 3 days isn't about the fence, and the way you looked at the road this afternoon wasn't about the cattle. So tell me about the water." I was quiet for a long moment. "You don't miss much," he said. "I've had to know what was wrong before it became a crisis," she said. "For a long time. It's a hard habit to break." Samuel set his pen down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her in the particular way he had. Direct, unhurried, like a man deciding whether a door was worth opening. "There's a creek," he said finally. "Upper tributary. It feeds the south pasture. About 2 months ago, somebody rerouted part of it." Clara kept her face still. "Rerouted it toward whose land?" "Toward land that belongs, on paper, to a holding company." Samuel's voice was even, but she could hear the careful control in it. Called the Meridian Land and Cattle Trust. You won't find an office for it in Redemption Creek. You have to go all the way to Denver to find out who holds the shares. And who holds the shares? Clara asked. Samuel looked at her. The man who left you on that platform, he said. Clara sat very still. The fire in the wood stove made its small sounds. The wind outside pushed against the eaves and then let go. Down the hall, the clock on the wall counted its seconds with the patient indifference of something that did not care what happened in rooms around it. Edward Caldwell owns the Meridian Land and Cattle Trust, she said. He's one of 3 shareholders, Samuel said. The other 2 are a mining investor out of Denver named Horace Van and a territorial official named Greer, who handles land deed approvals for this county. He's got a county official in his pocket, Clara said. He's had Greer in his pocket for 5 years, Samuel said. Long enough that I stopped expecting fair treatment from that office and started making sure every one of my property documents is filed in Denver directly. But filing in Denver takes time, and while I'm being careful, Caldwell is moving fast. He wants your land, Clara said. I wants the whole ridge, Samuel said. My 600 acres sit between 2 parcels he already owns. If he gets mine, he connects them. He can run the water rights across the whole ridge and negotiate with the mining operations on the north side. It's worth 10 times what the cattle are worth to him. And rerouting the creek, Clara said slowly. That's just the beginning. That's just the beginning, he agreed. She thought about the ledger. The quiet bleed of numbers over 3 seasons. The payments under pressure. How long has he been doing this? She asked. Samuel's jaw tightened. Since his first offer to buy came back refused, he said. 3 years. 3 years. Clara let that sit for a moment. 3 years of a man chipping away at another man's livelihood, methodically, patiently, the way you might work at a stone wall, not battering it directly because that would make noise, but finding the small fractures and pressing until they widened. What are you going to do? She asked. What I've been doing, Samuel said. Hold on. Holding on isn't a strategy, Clara said. It's just surviving. He looked at her. She met his gaze and did not soften it. I know that, he said quietly. I know it better than you might think. Something in his voice shifted, not sharply, but the way light shifts when a cloud moves over it, changing what you can see without changing what's there. Clara recognized the sound of a man who had been holding on for reasons that had nothing to do with land or money, and she did not push any further that night. But she went to her room, and she didn't sleep. She lay on her back with her hands laced behind her head, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about 6 years of managing a household budget that had no room for error. She thought about reading every legal document her father had ever signed, sitting beside him at the kitchen table, because he'd said a person who understood their own papers was a person who couldn't be cheated. She thought about the county deed clerk in Harlow, Missouri, who had tried to attach a lien to their land after her father got sick, and how she'd found the error in his paperwork, a single transposed number in a legal description, and how she'd walked into his office and laid the document in front of him, without raising her voice, and watched the color change in his face. She thought about Meridian Land and Cattle Trust. She thought about a creek rerouted so gradually, so carefully, that by the time you noticed the damage, the paperwork justifying it was already filed somewhere difficult to challenge. She thought about Edward Caldwell on that train platform, holding money out to her like she was a problem to be dispensed with. She made a decision. In the morning, she went to Samuel before breakfast and asked him to show her every property document he had. He stared at her. Why? He asked. Because I want to see something, she said. Clara. He said her name carefully, the way you say a word when you're not certain you're using it right. It was the first time he'd used her first name. You don't need to get involved in this. I found your ledger 3 days ago, she said. I put it back. I should have told you then, but I didn't know yet what I was looking for. He was very still. You read my ledger. I wasn't looking for it. I found it reaching for a candle. She kept her voice level. What I read told me you've been under financial pressure for at least 2 years, and that 2 of the entries in the past 6 months look like payments made under duress. I want to see the documents those payments correspond to, and I want to see your original land deed and the water rights filings." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved through several different expressions. Surprise, a flicker of something that might have been anger, and then something quieter underneath it. Something that looked almost like relief. "All right," he said. He brought out the documents. Clara spread them across the table and spent the next 2 hours going through them the way her father had taught her, slowly, in order, looking for the gap between what something said and what something meant. Legal language had a way of hiding its truths in small phrases and subordinate clauses and carefully chosen words that meant one thing to a man in a hurry, and another thing entirely to a woman with time and attention, and a healthy distrust of people who drafted their own favorable terms. She found what she was looking for in the 47th page of a county easement agreement filed 18 months earlier. She read it twice to be certain. Then she set it flat on the table and pressed her finger to a single paragraph near the bottom of the page. "Read this," she said. Samuel leaned over. He read it. He read it again. "That's not," he started. "That's not what you agreed to," Clara said. "I know. The original easement you signed gives Caldwell's Meridian Trust access to the eastern fence line for cattle driving purposes. Standard arrangement. But this paragraph, this one here, extends the easement to include any associated water conveyance infrastructure currently in use or subsequently established within 40 yards of the eastern boundary." Samuel straightened slowly. "Which would include the Upper Creek tributary," he said. "The one that was rerouted," Clara said. "Yes. That paragraph wasn't in the original agreement I signed." "No," Clara said. "It wasn't." The word settled between them with the particular weight of something that changes the entire shape of a situation you thought you understood. "Greer's office," Samuel said. "Someone amended the document after you signed it," Clara said. "Whether it was Greer himself or someone with access to his office, I can't tell you. But the amendment is there, and it's what they used to justify the rerouting, and if you tried to challenge it in the county court, you'd be challenging a filed document in the court where Greer's influence runs deep." She paused. "But?" Samuel looked at her sharply. "But?" he said. "Look at the date on this amendment." She tapped the page. "It was filed October 3rd. Your original easement was signed September 12th. 3 weeks later," Samuel said. 3 weeks later, Clara confirmed. "And here," she pulled a second document from the stack, "is your copy of the original easement, the one with your signature, September 12th, no amendment paragraph." Samuel stared at the 2 documents. "They changed it after I signed it," he said. "And filed the changed version," Clara said. "Which means there are 2 versions. Yours and the county's. And the county version has language yours doesn't, which means someone altered a legal document after the fact." She looked up at him. "That's not a civil property dispute, Samuel. That's fraud." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Samuel moved to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, and Clara watched the tension in his shoulders and let him have the moment, because she understood that a man who had spent 3 years holding on and fighting in the only way he knew, quietly, stubbornly, alone, needed a moment to adjust to the shape of a different kind of fight. "I need to get to Denver," he said finally. "You need to get to Denver with both documents," Clara said. "The original and this one. You need to file a complaint with the Territorial Land Office, not the county. And you need to do it before Caldwell has any reason to think you've found this." He turned back from the window. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "My father," she said simply. "He believed that the only thing standing between an honest man and the people who wanted to take from him was the ability to read his own papers and understand what they said." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man," he said. "He was," Clara said. "And she said it the way you say something that still has edges on it, something you've learned to carry, but not yet learned to put down gently." Samuel heard it. "I didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer the particular brand of sympathy that people offered when they didn't know what else to do. He simply nodded once, the way you acknowledge something real, and Clara found that she appreciated that more than almost anything he could have said. Then Pete came through the door without knocking, and both of them looked up. The young hand's face was wrong. Too pale. Moving too fast. "Boss," Pete said. "Rider coming up from the South Road. It's Caldwell's man. The one they call Tanner." Samuel's expression shifted instantly. Not panic. He wasn't a man who panicked, but a rapid, precise reorganization of his attention, the kind Clara had seen in people who had learned to respond to threats without telegraphing the fact that they'd recognized one. "How many?" Samuel said. "Just him," Pete said. "Riding alone. But he's got papers." Samuel looked at Clara. She was already gathering the documents from the table. "Where's the false easement?" she said quietly. "Here." He pointed, and she lifted it from the pile. "Give me 30 seconds, she said, and she moved to her room and put the amended document flat under the mattress on her bed, and came back and found Samuel standing in the front room with the original easement in his hand, and the rest of the papers in their normal order on the desk. She sat down in the chair by the window. She picked up the sewing she'd been doing the previous evening. She looked like a woman who had been there all morning doing nothing of consequence. Samuel glanced at her. She did not look up from her sewing. He went to the door. Tanner was a thick-necked man in his 40s with small eyes and the careful, courteous manner of someone who used good manners as a tool rather than a habit. He came in when Samuel invited him, looked around the room, noticed Clara, and gave her a nod that was technically polite and actually dismissive in the practiced way of a man who had learned to look at women and see furniture. "Mr. Carter," he said, "Mr. Caldwell asked me to deliver this." He held out an envelope. "He hopes you'll find the terms reasonable." Samuel took the envelope without opening it. "I'll look it over," Samuel said. "He was hoping for a response today," Tanner said. "I'll look it over," Samuel said again, in exactly the same tone. Tanner smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind that acknowledged the answer without accepting it. "Of course," he said. "He also wanted me to mention, just in passing, that the county engineer will be assessing water distribution claims in this district next month. He thought you'd want to know, given the easement situation." "Thoughtful of him," Samuel said. "He's a thoughtful man," Tanner agreed. Clara kept her eyes on her sewing. She counted the stitches to keep her breathing even. Tanner left. Samuel closed the door and stood with his back to it and opened the envelope and read what was inside. "New offer," he said. "Lower than the last one." "He's establishing a trend," Clara said, putting down her sewing. "Each offer lower than the last, so when he finally forces a sale, through the water rights or through more pressure on the county, he's already set a paper record that he offered fair market value and you declined. It makes the forced sale look like his last resort instead of his plan from the beginning." Samuel was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I think like a woman who grew up watching men take things from other people and call it business," she said. He set the envelope down. "I'm riding to Denver," he said. "The day after tomorrow, early." "I'm coming with you," Clara said. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't tell me it's not my fight. I found the document. I understand the document. If you go to the Territorial Land Office alone, and they ask you technical questions about the amendment language and the filing dates, you will need someone with you who can answer them clearly." She met his eyes. "And I have nothing else to do, Samuel. I have nowhere else to be. Please let me help." He was very still for a moment. Then, "We leave at first light," he said. "It's a long day's ride." The day before they left was the day Clara learned about Margaret. She didn't learn it from Samuel. She learned it the way you learn most important things, indirectly, in pieces, from a source that didn't intend to tell you as much as they did. She was in the kitchen garden late in the afternoon. The garden had been badly neglected, and she'd started working it because the weeds alone were going to strangle whatever was still trying to grow. When Hector came to help her with the fence post at the garden's edge that had worked itself loose. They worked in companionable silence for a while, and then Hector said, without particular preamble, "The garden used to be Margaret's." Clara didn't stop working. Who was Margaret? Hector was quiet for a beat too long, and she knew immediately that he'd assumed she knew. His wife, Hector said carefully. She passed. Winter of '82. Hard season that year. Ice storm came through in February, and she was already... He stopped. She was already not well. Clara kept her hands moving. How long were they married? She asked. 4 years, Hector said. She was something. Ran this place as much as he did. The garden was hers. The kitchen was hers. When she was gone, he just... Hector shook his head. He closed it all up. Didn't touch the garden. Didn't change anything in the kitchen. Just went on working and stopped thinking about anything that wasn't the cattle or the fence lines. Clara thought about the kitchen when she first arrived. The careful organization of it, the sparse shelves, the single set of tin plates. The cleanliness that came not from indifference, but from a man who had maintained one small thing, because maintaining it was the only way he knew how to hold on to what it used to mean. He never told me, Clara said. He doesn't tell anyone, Hector said. He didn't tell us much either, but we were here. We could see. He paused. Miss Whitmore, you staying a while? Clara thought about Missouri. She thought about Edward Caldwell's money left on a platform and a letter at the bottom of an empty suitcase. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Hector nodded like that was a fair answer. That evening, after supper, Clara was washing the dishes when Samuel came and stood beside her and picked up a cloth to dry without being asked. They worked in silence. Then Clara said, "What was Margaret like?" The cup in his hand went still for just a moment. Hector told you, he said. Not angry, just knowing. He mentioned her name and I asked, Clara said. You don't have to tell me anything. He stood there with the cup in his hand and the cloth and the silence stretching between them, and then he said, she was fierce. That's the first word that comes to mind when I think of her. She was small, and she was fierce, and she worked harder than any person I've ever known, and she laughed loud enough to hear from the barn. He paused. She had a way of making you feel like the world was bigger than you thought it was, like there was more to everything. Clara kept washing. She sounds like someone worth grieving properly, she said. I don't know that I ever did, he said quietly. I just went to work. That's a kind of grieving, Clara said. It's the kind that doesn't finish, he said. She handed him the last cup. Their hands didn't touch, but it was close enough that Clara was aware of the proximity, the way you're aware of heat. Not uncomfortable, just present, just there. Thank you for telling me, she said. He dried the cup and set it on the shelf and hung the cloth on the hook and said, Get some sleep. Long ride tomorrow. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She thought about a woman named Margaret, who had made a garden grow and laughed loud enough to hear from the barn. She thought about the particular cruelty of losing someone like that. Not just the person, but the world feels bigger that they carried. She thought about Samuel Carter going to work. Just going to work, day after day. Holding on to the land because the land was what was left. She thought, I understand that. She thought, I understand that better than almost anything. They left at first light as promised, Samuel driving and Clara sitting straight on the wagon seat with the original easement and her own careful notes folded in the inside pocket of her coat. The morning was cold, the way mountain mornings are cold in June, thin and sharp and bright, like the world hasn't quite committed yet to warmth. They rode for 2 hours without much conversation. But it wasn't the silence of two strangers. It had changed into something else. The silence of two people who had said enough real things to each other that silence no longer felt like distance. At the top of the ridge, Samuel pulled the wagon to the side of the road. He looked out over the valley below, the spread of Redemption Creek visible in the distance, the patchwork of land and road, and the thin silver line of the creek they were fighting over. And his jaw was doing that thing it did when he was running through something in his head and hadn't decided what to do with it yet. I need to tell you something, he said. Clara waited. When I walked toward you on that platform, he said, It wasn't entirely selfless. She looked at him. I mean that I walked over because what I saw was a woman who was going to be all right. I didn't know you, but I could see that you were going to be all right and I... He stopped and looked out at the valley. I hadn't seen that in a long time. Someone who could look at a bad situation and refuse to break. I needed to be near that for a while, even if I couldn't explain why. Clara was quiet. That's a strange thing to say to a person, she said finally. I know, he said. But I understand it, she said. He looked at her. I came west because I needed to believe things could be different, she said. I ended up on a platform in a town where I didn't know a soul, and you walked over. She looked at the valley below. I don't think either of us was wrong about needing something. I think we just found it in a place neither of us expected. He picked up the reins. He didn't say anything else, but something had settled between them. Not resolved, not named, just acknowledged in the way that two careful people acknowledge things when they're both still deciding how much they trust the ground beneath them. They were halfway down the mountain when the trouble found them. Two riders came up from a side road and fell in alongside the wagon at a pace that was too deliberate to be accidental. Clara recognized one of them as one of Tanner's men. She'd seen him at the edge of the property twice in the past week, watching the fence line in the practiced way of someone paid to establish presence without providing obvious cause for complaint. "Morning, Carter," the rider said. "Headed to Denver?" Samuel's voice was perfectly even. "That's my business. Mr. Caldwell likes to know when his neighbors are making the long ride," the man said pleasantly, "in case they need anything along the way." "We don't," Samuel said. The man smiled and dropped back, but Clara looked over her shoulder and watched him pull off onto a high ridge trail that angled southeast, away from Redemption Creek and in the direction of the telegraph office in the next town over. "He's going to wire someone," she said quietly. "I know," Samuel said. "Then whatever we file in Denver, Caldwell's going to know about it before we get back." "Yes," Samuel said. "Does that change what we're doing?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "It changes how fast we have to move once we get there," he said. "That's all." Clara turned back forward. She pressed her hand against the inside pocket of her coat where the documents were folded. Her father had told her once, "The law is slow and justice is slower, but a paper filed in the right place at the right time is a thing that endures." Get your paper in the right place, Clara. The rest takes care of itself. She held on to that. The mountains moved past them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And two people who had both come to the end of what they'd been carrying alone rode down out of them together toward the beginning of something neither one of them had planned, and both of them, without saying so, had begun to need. In Denver, the Territorial Land Office was a large building that smelled of old paper and institutional patience. Clara had expected to feel small in it. Instead, she felt exactly the right size. The size of someone who had done the reading, who had the documents, who knew precisely what she was saying and why it mattered. The clerk at the counter was a thin man with spectacles and the permanent mild expression of someone who had heard every story 3 times. He looked at Samuel. He almost didn't look at Clara. Clara set the 2 documents on the counter side by side. "I need to speak with the senior land officer," she said. "We have evidence of a material alteration to a filed easement document in Redemption Creek County. The alteration was made after the signing party's signature was obtained and before the document was recorded. That constitutes document fraud, and I'd like to file a formal complaint." The clerk looked down at the documents. He looked up at Clara. He looked at Samuel. Samuel said nothing. He simply stood slightly behind and to her left in the quiet, deliberate way of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, giving her the floor entirely, making clear without a word that she was the one speaking and the one to be heard. The clerk disappeared through a door behind him. He came back 2 minutes later. "The senior officer will see you," he said. Clara picked up the documents. She walked through the door, and the case that Edward Caldwell had been building for 3 years, quietly, expensively, patiently, began, in the offices of the Colorado Territorial Land Authority, to crack. The senior land officer's name was Aldrich. He was a man in his late 50s, with the weathered, careful face of someone who had spent decades distinguishing between people who came to his office with legitimate grievances and people who came to waste his time, and he had developed a precise internal instrument for telling the difference within the first 60 seconds of a conversation. He looked at Clara's documents for 4 minutes without saying a word. Clara let him look. She had learned from her father that silence in a legal context was not weakness. It was patience, and patience was the thing that separated people who understood what they were doing from people who were afraid of what they didn't know. Samuel stood just inside the door with his hat in his hands. Aldrich looked up. "Where did you find the discrepancy?" he asked Clara directly. Not Samuel. Clara. "Page 47, she said. Third paragraph from the bottom. The water conveyance language does not appear in Mr. Carter's original copy of the easement, which bears his signature and the notary stamp from September 12th. The county-filed version carries identical formatting and the same notary stamp, but includes a paragraph that was not present in the original signing." Aldrich looked back at the documents. "The stamp is the same," he said. "The stamp is the same," Clara confirmed, "which means either the notary participated or the document was carefully reconstructed around the original stamp impression. I'm not a document examiner, but I'd suggest that's exactly what an expert examination would need to determine." Aldrich set both documents side by side and looked at them for another long moment. Then he did something Clara had not expected. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a magnifying glass and bent close to the page. He stayed like that for nearly a full minute. When he straightened up, his expression had changed. "The ink on the amendment paragraph," he said carefully, "is marginally lighter than the ink on the surrounding text." "Yes," Clara said. "I noticed that too." "How?" he said. Not skeptical, genuinely curious. "My father taught me to read documents against a window," she said. "The light shows you things the flat desk doesn't." Aldrich looked at her over the top of his spectacles. "Your father was an attorney?" he said. "My father was a Missouri farmer who didn't trust anyone else to understand his own papers," she said. "He taught me everything he knew." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitmore, I'm going to need to retain both of these documents. I'm going to open a formal inquiry, and I need you to understand that what you're alleging, document fraud in a county land office with a named territorial official, is a serious charge that will take time to investigate properly." "I understand," Clara said. "It will also," he said, looking at Samuel now, "put you in a difficult position in the short term, Mr. Carter, if Caldwell's people learn a complaint has been filed." "They already know we're here," Samuel said quietly. "We were followed from the mountain." Aldrich absorbed that. "Then you need to move carefully when you get back," he said. "Don't change anything visible on the ranch. Don't confront Caldwell or Greer directly. Let this office do its work." He looked at Clara again. "Do you have other documentation? Records of the water rerouting? Dates of incidents?" "I have the beginning of one," Clara said. "I've been keeping notes since Mr. Carter told me about the creek situation 4 days ago. I can have a comprehensive record ready within the week." Aldrich nodded slowly. "Get it to me as quickly as you can," he said. "Through the Territorial Postal Office, not the county. Don't use the Redemption Creek Mail Office for anything related to this matter." "Understood," Clara said. She and Samuel walked out of that building into the afternoon air, and Clara felt the particular kind of steadiness that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from the knowledge that you have done the right thing in the right way, and the rest is no longer entirely in your hands. Samuel was quiet all the way to the wagon. Then he stopped and looked at her. "You were remarkable in there," he said. Clara shook her head. "I was prepared. Most people with your preparation would have been nervous," he said. "You weren't." "I was," she said. "I just didn't let it into my voice." He studied her for a moment. "Your father raised someone extraordinary," he said. Clara looked away, not because it embarrassed her, because it was the kind of thing that, when it hit the part of her that still missed him the most, had a weight she wasn't always ready for in public. "Let's get back before dark," she said. They were 2 hours out of Denver when the rain started. Not a gentle rain, A mountain storm that came down fast and cold, with the particular aggression of weather that doesn't negotiate. Samuel pulled the wagon off the road and under the partial shelter of a stand of trees, and they sat there wrapped in the blankets he kept under the seat, listening to the rain hammer the canopy above them and watching the road turn to mud in the gray afternoon light. "We're not making it back tonight," Samuel said. "No," Clara agreed. "There's a settlement about a mile east. Widow named Pearson runs a clean boarding house." "All right," Clara said. They sat for another moment. The rain didn't ease. "Samuel," Clara said. What happens if the inquiry takes months?" He was quiet. "Caldwell won't wait months," she said. "If his man wired ahead, he knows we filed something. He'll accelerate whatever he was planning next." "I know," Samuel said. "So what does that look like? What does he do next?" Samuel pulled the blanket tighter. Outside, the rain hammered on. "He goes after the cattle routes," Samuel said. "That's my guess. The south pasture is compromised by the water rerouting, but I can manage through the summer if I rearrange grazing patterns. The cattle routes, though. There are 2 roads I use to move stock to market. One passes through county land. The other has a shared use agreement with the Meridian Trust's adjacent parcel." "And if they close the shared use route," Clara said, "then I'm moving cattle over county land where I need a permit that Greer's office approves," Samuel said, "and Greer will stall that permit indefinitely." Clara thought about this. "How long before the next cattle drive?" she said. 6 weeks, he said. "Maybe 7. "Then we have 6 weeks to get ahead of it," Clara said. "Alternative routes, alternative markets, whatever I need to document about the shared use agreement, so we have something to file if they move against it." Samuel turned to look at her in the gray afternoon light. "You said we," he said. Clara met his gaze steadily. "I said we," she confirmed. Something moved through his eyes. Something that was not quite what she expected. Not gratitude exactly, but something more complicated and more genuine than gratitude. Something that looked like a man who had been alone in a difficult situation for a very long time and had just registered, with a shock that went quiet rather than loud, that he was not alone anymore. He looked back at the rain. "We," he said quietly, like he was getting used to the sound of it. The boarding house was warm, and Mrs. Pearson was efficient and asked no questions beyond what rooms were needed. And Clara lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the rain slow and then stop, and the mountain silence come back in beneath it, vast and clean. And she thought about what she had told Aldrich. "My father was a Missouri farmer who didn't trust anyone else to understand his own papers." She thought about how true that was, and how much of who she was had come from those hours at the kitchen table. Her father's broad index finger moving along the lines of a document, his voice patient and serious. "Read it again, Clara. Read it until you know what it's saying and what it's hiding. They're not always the same thing." He had been right. They were almost never the same thing. She slept eventually and dreamed of the farm in Harlow, and woke to mountain light through thin curtains and the smell of coffee coming up from downstairs, and the knowledge that she had a great deal of work to do. They were back at the ranch by early afternoon. Hector met them at the gate with his hat in his hand and his face doing something careful that Clara had learned meant news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "What happened?" Samuel said. "Last night," Hector said. "Somebody cut the fence line on the north corner." Samuel was off the wagon before Hector finished speaking. "How bad?" 12 head got through," Hector said. "We got 10 of them back this morning. 2 are still out, could be anywhere on the North Ridge by now." "Cattle or wire?" Samuel said. "Clean cut," Hector said. "Not a break, a cut." Samuel's jaw went tight. "It's starting," Clara said quietly from the wagon. Both men looked at her. "He accelerated," she said. "Like I said, he knows we filed something." Samuel turned back to Hector. "Pete watching the south line?" "Since dawn," Hector said. "Tell him to stay there. I'll take the North Ridge." He turned to Clara. "I need you to stay close to the house today," he said. "I'll be inside working on the documentation for Aldrich," she said. "That's the most useful thing I can do right now anyway." He looked at her for a moment, in the particular way she had come to recognize as his version of saying something he didn't have words for yet. Then he turned and went. Clara spent the next 3 days at the desk in the front room, building what she privately thought of as a case file. She organized it the way her father had taught her, chronologically, with every incident dated and described in plain factual language, every document referenced by its filing number, every witness identified by name. She wrote to Hector and Pete formally, asking them to write down in their own words what they had observed regarding the water rerouting and the fence cutting, and both men, Pete haltingly, Hector with a careful precision that surprised her, produced written statements that she incorporated into the file. She also did something she hadn't told Samuel about. She wrote a letter to the county land clerk's office in the next county, not Greer's County, the adjacent one, requesting copies of all easement agreements involving the Meridian Land and Cattle Trust filed in the past 5 years. She sent it through the Territorial Postal Office as Aldrich had instructed, using the address of a general store in Denver that Aldrich had given them as a mail point. She didn't tell Samuel because she wasn't yet certain what she'd find, and she had learned not to raise hopes that facts might not support. On the 4th day after they returned from Denver, Edward Caldwell came to the ranch himself. He did not send Tanner. He came personally, riding alone, which Clara recognized immediately as a deliberate choice. The performance of a man who wanted to seem unthreatening, who wanted to frame this as a neighborly conversation between gentlemen rather than what it actually was. He came in the mid-morning, when Samuel was out on the North Ridge still looking for the 2 missing cattle. Clara was the only one in the house. She heard the hoofbeats and looked out the window. She recognized him immediately. She put down her pen. She did not panic. She did not hide the documents, because the documents she most needed to protect were already posted to Denver. What remained on the desk was material she had intentionally left visible. Selected records that told a particular story, not the story she was building for Aldrich, but a slightly different arrangement of facts that conveyed the impression of a woman keeping careful household accounts. Nothing that would alarm a sharp man. Everything that would confirm his existing assessment of her. She went to the door before he knocked. She opened it. Edward Caldwell stopped. He hadn't expected her to be the one at the door. She could see that in the fractional adjustment his expression made. A quick reordering behind his eyes. A recalibration. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. She did not step back to invite him in. She stood in the doorway and looked at him with the particular calm of a woman who has nothing to prove to the person she's looking at and knows it. "I'm here to see Samuel," he said. "He's out on the ridge," Clara said. "Someone cut his north fence line 4 nights ago. He's been recovering cattle." Something flickered in Caldwell's face. "Unfortunate," he said. "Isn't it?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, with the analytical attention of a man accustomed to measuring people and finding numbers he could use. "I won't pretend the situation between us isn't awkward," he said. "What happened at the station, I handled it poorly." "You handled it exactly as you intended to," Clara said. "What you mean is that you're reconsidering whether it served your purposes." His eyes sharpened. She had surprised him. She had spoken more directly than he expected, and she had named the thing he was actually doing, rather than accepting the version he was offering her. "You're very direct," he said. "My father always said it saved time," she said. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is Samuel planning to be long?" "I don't know," Clara said. "Would you like me to tell him you came?" He looked at her steadily. "Tell him I'd like to resolve things amicably," he said. "Tell him my offer stands, and I'm willing to discuss terms that are fair to everyone." "I'll tell him," Clara said. Caldwell turned to go. Then he stopped and looked back at her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I hope you're being careful." It was framed as concern. It landed like a warning. "I always am," Clara said. "It was lovely of you to come all this way." She closed the door. She stood just inside it with her hand flat on the wood, and her heart going at a pace she refused to let onto her face while he was watching, and she breathed through it carefully until she heard the hoofbeats moving away down the road. Then she went back to the desk. She picked up her pen. She wrote down the time of his visit, his exact words, and her assessment of the intent behind them, and added it to the file. Samuel came back 2 hours later with one of the missing cattle found and one still out. He came in looking tired and windburned, and Clara poured him coffee and told him about Caldwell's visit in a level, factual voice. Samuel sat very still through the whole account. When she finished, he said, "He threatened you." He made a remark structured to resemble concern, Clara said, which a careful man would do because a direct threat leaves evidence. "Clara." His voice was tight. "I'm all right," she said. "He came here while I was gone on purpose," Samuel said. "He timed it." "Yes," she said, "which tells us something." "It tells us he's not afraid of me," Samuel said. "He wanted to see what you'd do. He's reassessing you." "He underestimated me at the station," Clara said. "He's trying to figure out how much to adjust that estimate." Samuel set his coffee cup down with more force than he intended. "I don't want him within a mile of you," he said. "That's not practical," Clara said, "and it's not what we should be focused on." "Clara." "Samuel." She kept her voice steady. "I am not afraid of Edward Caldwell. I dealt with men like him in Missouri at the county clerk's office, and in the dry goods store, and in every room where someone thought a woman with a suitcase full of responsibility and no money to show for it was an easy target. I know how to handle this. What I need from you right now is not protection. What I need is to know if there's a way onto your property from the East Ridge that doesn't pass through the shared use agreement corridor." He stared at her. Then something in his face changed. The protective fury drained out of it slowly, replaced by something quieter and more complicated. The look of a man who had tried to shield people he cared about for so long that he'd forgotten some people didn't need shielding. Some people needed working beside. "There's an old trail," he said slowly, "from when the previous owner ran sheep. It's overgrown. Hasn't been used in 15 years. Can cattle use it?" He thought about it. "With some clearing," he said. "A week's work, maybe." "Then we start clearing it," Clara said, "before Caldwell moves on the shared use route." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "And one more thing," Clara said. "I need to tell you what I did before you came back." He waited. "I sent a letter to the land clerk's office in Hargrove County," she said, "requesting easement records for the Meridian Trust, the same amendment method they used on your document. If they used it on yours, they may have used it on others. If I can find 2 or 3 more altered documents, the fraud complaint goes from one man's disputed paperwork to a pattern. A pattern is much harder to dismiss." The room was quiet. Samuel was looking at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't entirely read, the one that had been appearing more often in the past few days, more open than she expected from a man who had built himself so carefully closed. "How long have you been planning that?" he asked. "Since the first night I looked at the ledger," she said. He was quiet for another moment. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "What do you want?" he said. "Not for the ranch, not for the case, for yourself. When this is over, what do you want?" The question caught her off guard in a way Caldwell's implied threat had not. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I haven't let myself think about that," she said honestly. "I stopped planning what I wanted when I stepped off that train." "Start again," he said quietly. "You should start planning again." She looked at him. He wasn't looking away. And for a moment the kitchen was very still, and the fire was very warm, and the mountains outside pressed close and enormous and permanent around the small, fragile fact of the two of them sitting across a table from each other, with everything unspoken, still humming in the air between them. Then Pete burst through the door. Both of them turned. Pete was breathing hard. His face was doing the wrong thing again. Too white, too fast, and this time with something underneath it that was more than urgency. "There are 3 men on the south fence line," he said, "armed, and they've got a paper." Samuel was on his feet. "What kind of paper?" he said. "I don't know," Pete said. "But they said they've got authority from the county to enforce an easement violation. They said—" He swallowed. "They said you've got 48 hours to vacate the south pasture, or they're authorized to secure it." The room went utterly silent. Clara thought, 48 hours. 2 days. Caldwell had been ready with this before they even left for Denver. He had the county paper already drawn up and waiting. He had not been responding to their visit to Aldrich. He had been moving on his own timeline the whole time, and the Denver trip had simply accelerated his timetable by a few days. "They're bluffing," Samuel said. "Maybe," Clara said. "But what if they're not?" He turned to look at her. "If Greer signed a county enforcement order," she said carefully, "even a fraudulent one, even one that will eventually be thrown out when Aldrich's investigation concludes, that order is technically valid right now. Resisting it gives Caldwell grounds to escalate. He can make you look like the one breaking the law." "So what do I do?" Samuel said. "Hand over my south pasture?" "No," Clara said. She stood up. "You go down to that fence line right now, and you tell those men that you are aware of the county order, that you dispute its legal validity, and that you have filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Authority in Denver regarding the underlying document. You say it calmly, and you say it clearly, and you make sure Pete and Hector are both standing there when you say it, so there are witnesses." She was already moving toward the desk. "And while you're doing that," she said, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper, "I am going to write an emergency correspondence to Aldrich explaining what just happened, and asking whether the Territorial Authority can issue a temporary hold on county enforcement while the investigation is open." She looked up at him. "Can we get a rider to Denver tonight?" "Hector can make it by morning if he leaves now," Samuel said. "Then get him ready," Clara said. "Go deal with those men first. I'll have the letter ready before you're back." Samuel grabbed his hat. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. "Clara," he said. She looked up from the paper. "We're going to win this," he said. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He walked out. She bent over the paper and started to write. Outside, she could hear Samuel's boots on the ground, moving fast but not running, heading toward the south fence line, where 3 armed men were standing with a county order that had been drafted by a corrupt official and engineered by a man who had decided that everything in this valley belonged to him if he wanted it badly enough. She wrote quickly. Her father's voice in her head, steady and patient. Name the facts. Give the dates. Use their own language against them. A document fights back the same way it does damage, with precision, with evidence, and with more patience than the other side expects. She finished the letter. She folded it and sealed it and addressed it to Aldrich at the Territorial Land Office and wrote "Urgent" across the outside of the envelope in her clearest hand. She took it to Hector, who was already saddling his horse. He took the letter without a word, tucked it inside his coat, and rode. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go. Then she turned back toward the south fence line, where she could hear, distantly, the sound of voices. Samuel's among them, level and clear, and underneath it, the lower register of the hired men with their county paper. And she stood very still and listened, and determined from the tone alone that the conversation was not collapsing into violence, which meant Samuel had gotten there in time and said the right things, and the next hours would be a waiting game. She was good at waiting. She had spent 6 years becoming very good at it. But this was different from the waiting she had done in Missouri. That had been the waiting of a person with no power over what happened next. Waiting for her father's illness to turn. Waiting for the money to come in. Waiting for something to change that she couldn't change herself. This was the waiting of a person who had already set something in motion. Who had put her father's letters in the right place at the right time. Who had found the ink, lighter on one side of a paragraph than the other, and known what it meant. Who had looked at a man who turned her away on a platform and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had never been given the luxury of fooling herself, that the battle he was fighting needed something he didn't have. She had provided it. She was still providing it. And the sun was going down over the mountains in that particular way it had out here. The way that looked, even to a woman who was not yet ready to call this place home, like something worth protecting. She went back inside. She lit the lamp. She pulled out the next page of the case file and kept working. 2 hours later, Samuel came through the door. I was still steady, still controlled. But underneath the steadiness was something that looked like a man who had spent 2 hours talking to people who wanted to take something from him and had done it without breaking. And the cost of that was sitting somewhere around his jaw and his shoulders. He saw the lamp, and the papers, and Clara at the desk. He sat down across from her. "They left," he said. "For now. I told them what you said. They wrote it down." "Good," Clara said. "Hector got away clean?" 20 minutes before those men arrived, Clara said. "He'll be in Denver by morning." Samuel nodded. He sat there for a moment, and Clara could see the toll of the day in him. Not weakness, not fear, but the particular exhaustion of a man who had held his ground under sustained pressure for 3 years and was starting to feel the accumulated weight of it in a different way, now that he was no longer holding it entirely alone. "I want to show you something," Clara said. She slid a piece of paper across the desk toward him. He looked at it. It was a hand-drawn diagram. Property lines, water routes, the existing easements, the old sheep trail. And alongside each element, a notation in Clara's neat handwriting. A legal reference, a filing date, an action item. "This is a map of everything we have and everything we need," she said. "Every asset, every vulnerability, every point where Caldwell can push, and what we do when he does. I've been building it for the past week." Samuel stared at the map for a long time. "You built this from memory?" he said. "From the documents?" "And from what you told me," she said. "And from the county records I requested." He looked at her. "Clara," he said, and his voice had the quality it had taken on recently. The quality of a man who had something to say, and was still deciding whether the ground was solid enough to stand on while he said it. "When you came here," he said slowly, "when I brought you back from that platform, I want you to know that I didn't have a plan. I saw a woman who deserved better than what was happening to her, and I acted on it. I didn't think beyond that night." "I know," Clara said. "But now," he said, "what's happened since then? What you've done for this ranch, for me. I need you to know that I see it. Every piece of it. And I'm not going to pretend it's just gratitude." The lamp between them made everything warm and small and close. Clara looked at him steadily. "We should get through this first," she said quietly. He nodded. "We should," he said. "But I wanted to say it, so you knew." From outside, far away, they heard a coyote, and then nothing but the mountains, doing what mountains do, holding everything in, patient and enormous and enduring, while inside a lamp burned, and 2 people sat across a desk covered in documents that were going to change both their lives. And the night came on, and the work was not finished, and neither of them was going anywhere. Hector came back from Denver on the 3rd day. Clara heard the horse before she saw him, and she was already at the door when he came through the gate, and something in the way he was riding, fast but not panicked, purposeful, told her that what he carried was not bad news, but not simple news either. The kind of news that changed the shape of things without resolving them. He handed her a sealed envelope before he even dismounted properly. She broke the seal and read it standing in the yard. Samuel came out of the barn. "Well?" he said. Clara read to the end before she looked up. "Aldrich filed a temporary administrative hold," she said. "The county enforcement order is suspended pending territorial review. Caldwell's men cannot legally move on the south pasture while the investigation is open." Samuel exhaled slowly. "That's good," he said. "It's very good," Clara said. "But read the second paragraph." She handed him the letter. He read it. His face did the thing it did when something confirmed a suspicion he had been hoping was wrong. "He found another one," Samuel said. "2 more," Clara said. "Aldrich's office has been quietly pulling easement documents on every property adjacent to Meridian Trust holdings in the county. The same amendment pattern, language inserted after signing, ink slightly inconsistent with the surrounding text, appears in 2 other ranchers' agreements. One of them is a man named Briggs, who sold his land 8 months ago. Aldrich believes he may have sold under the impression that the amended easement left him legally exposed, when in fact the document was fraudulent." Samuel set the letter down. "Briggs thought he had no choice," Samuel said. "Because he was shown an altered document and told it was binding," Clara said. "And he didn't have anyone to look at it the way I looked at yours." "So Caldwell's done this before," Samuel said. "To more than just me." At minimum 3 times, Clara said. Which means Aldrich is no longer investigating a property dispute. He's investigating a criminal conspiracy. She paused. He's asking for a federal land examiner. He's taking this above the territorial level. The words settled in the mountain air between them. Federal. That was a different word than territorial. That was a word that meant Edward Caldwell could no longer manage this in Denver. That meant the reach of what Clara had started on a kitchen table with a ledger and a candle, and her dead father's patient instruction had just extended somewhere that Caldwell's money and Greer's county authority could not follow. Hector was watching them both. "Is it over?" he asked. "No," Samuel said quietly. "It's just beginning." "But the beginning is in our favor," Clara said. "For the first time." She looked at Samuel. He looked back at her. And for a moment on that ordinary morning in the yard, in the plain mountain light, something passed between them that was not romantic and not dramatic and not anything that could be neatly named. It was simply the recognition of two people who had been in the same fight together and had just learned they were winning. And the feeling was so unfamiliar to both of them that neither one knew quite what to do with it. Samuel looked away first. "I need to tell Hector and Pete what this means for the next few weeks," he said. "Different watch schedule. I don't want anyone on this property alone." "I'll make coffee," Clara said. "Clara." He stopped without turning. "Thank you." She did not say "you're welcome," because that felt insufficient. She said, "Your father would have done the same thing mine did. He would have kept records and read the fine print and refused to let them take what was his." She paused. "I'm just doing it for you because you can't be in 2 places at once." He turned to look at her then. She went inside before he could answer. The next 9 days were the strangest of Clara's life, and she had lived through enough strange days to have a real basis for comparison. On the surface, they were ordinary days. She cooked and tended the garden and continued building the documentation file and kept up her correspondence with Aldrich through the Denver mail point. Samuel rode the property lines and cleared the old sheep trail with Pete and Hector, working in 3-hour shifts so the line was never unmonitored. The south pasture held. Caldwell's men appeared twice at the road's edge and did nothing, which was the behavior of men who had been told to wait and didn't like it. But beneath the ordinary surface, something was shifting. It was the small things, as it always is. The way Samuel started saving her the last cup of coffee in the morning, without being asked, and without making anything of it. The way he had started saying her name differently. Not Clara the woman he'd helped, but Clara the person he was used to, which was a different weight entirely. The way he had begun to include her automatically in decisions about the ranch, not asking for her permission, not treating her like a manager, but checking her thinking the way a person checks their footing before they step somewhere important. And on her side, she noticed things she had not let herself notice before. She noticed that he was funny, quietly and without effort, the kind of funny that surfaces when a person is comfortable rather than performing. She noticed that he was patient with Pete in a way that was not condescending but genuinely instructive, the patience of a man who remembered what it was to not know something. She noticed that he read actual books, not just newspapers, and that he read the way she did, with attention, making the occasional quiet sound that meant something had struck him. She noticed, with the clarity of a woman who had learned not to fool herself, that she had stopped thinking of the ranch as a temporary arrangement. She had not made a decision about this. It had simply happened, the way some things happen, not as an event, but as a slow accumulation of ordinary moments until you look up and realize the landscape has changed. She was thinking about this, late on the 10th night after Hector's return from Denver, when the sound of a horse coming up the road at speed pulled her out of her chair. Too fast for a casual visitor. Too late for a social call. She was at the window before Samuel was out of his room, and what she saw in the dark was a single rider moving hard and pulling up short at the gate. And even before the rider called out, she recognized the horse as one of the livery animals from Redemption Creek. "Carter!" The rider's voice was high with urgency. "Carter, you need to come. It's Greer." Samuel was out the door. Clara came after him. The rider was a young man she'd seen in town. Worked at the general store, she thought. Maybe 17 years old. with the look of someone who'd been handed a task he didn't fully understand and had executed it with more speed than judgment. "What about Greer?" Samuel said. "He's at the saloon," the boy said. "He's been drinking since this afternoon. The boy paused, working out how to say it. "He's saying things. About the land office. About Caldwell. He's saying things that people are writing down." Samuel and Clara looked at each other. "He's talking," Clara said. "Drunk," Samuel said. "It doesn't matter," Clara said immediately. "What matters is that he's talking in public and people are hearing it. If someone in that saloon has enough sense to ask the right questions." "We need someone in that saloon right now," Samuel said. "Yes," Clara said. "We do." He looked at her. She was already reaching for her coat. "Clara, you can't go into a saloon at this hour." "I absolutely can," she said. "And I'm going to, because I know what questions to ask, and you," she pointed at him, "are going to make Greer defensive the moment he sees you. He knows you. He knows what he's done to you. The moment you walk through that door, whatever he's saying stops." Samuel opened his mouth. "I'm not arguing about this," Clara said. "I'm going. You're going to wait outside. If anything goes wrong, I'll come out. Nothing is going to go wrong." He looked at her for a very long moment. Then he picked up his hat. "I'm standing 20 feet from the door," he said. "That's fine," she said. The saloon in Redemption Creek was not a place Clara had entered before, but she walked through the door with the particular confidence of a woman who had decided that the opinions of strangers were not currently her most pressing concern. The room was not full. It was past 11 on a weekday. But there were enough men at the tables and along the bar to constitute an audience. And at the far end of the bar was a heavy-set man in a county official's coat who was definitely drunk and definitely talking. And the two men next to him were definitely listening with the bright-eyed attention of people who understood they were hearing something worth remembering. Clara went to the bar. She ordered a cup of coffee. The barman gave her a look that she returned without blinking. And she took her coffee and moved to a position close enough to Greer to hear him clearly without being in his direct eye line. Greer was a man in his 50s with the red complexion of someone who drank regularly and the particular looseness around the mouth that came from a man who was past the point where his judgment was catching up to his tongue. How was saying, "Told me it was standard procedure. Said every land office in the territory does it. Adjustments, corrections. He called them corrections." He laughed, and the laugh was ugly. The laugh of a man who knew he'd done wrong and had spent a long time making the wrong sound normal. "Corrections. First time I let him correct a document, I told myself it was a gray area. Second time." "Second time?" one of the listening men said. "Second time I knew what it was," Greer said. "But by then," he turned his glass, "by then I was in it, wasn't I? Man's in it, he's in it." "How many times?" the other man asked. Clara kept her eyes on her coffee. Her hand was very still. "Don't know exactly," Greer said. "Lost count. He'd send Tanner with the document and a number, and I'd—" He stopped. Something shifted in his face. The alcohol-loose expression tightened for a moment, like a man who'd walked to the edge of something and looked down. "I've said enough." "William." The man next to him, a rancher, from the look of him, someone who probably knew Greer socially, put his hand on Greer's arm. "William, are you saying Caldwell paid you to change documents?" Greer looked at his glass. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. And the man with his hand on Greer's arm was looking at the man beside him with the expression of someone putting a great many things together very rapidly. Clara finished her coffee. She set the cup down quietly and walked to the door. Outside, Samuel was exactly where he said he'd be, 20 feet from the door, standing in the dark with his hat on and his hands in his coat pockets. And the moment she came out, his whole body oriented toward her with the focused attention of a man who had spent 30 minutes outside that door, not enjoying the experience. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. He talked. He didn't name numbers, but he admitted Caldwell paid him to alter documents, and he said it was more than once, and he lost count. She kept her voice low, precise. "There are 3 men in there who heard every word. One of them is a rancher. I don't know his name, but I'd recognize him. And he was asking the right questions. Which rancher? Samuel said. Tall, gray coat, scar on the left side of his jaw. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Dan Mercer, he said. He's got land 2 valleys over. He sold a parcel 18 months ago. He stopped. To Meridian Trust? Clara said. To a holding company, Samuel said. I didn't know which one. Clara thought about Aldrich's letter. The man named Briggs, who sold under the impression his easement left him exposed. Mercer might be the third case, she said. The one Aldrich didn't have a name for yet. Samuel swore quietly. Caldwell didn't just take from me, he said. He built a system, Clara said. He needed Greer in the county office, and he needed a pattern of purchasing distressed properties to hide what the pattern actually was. She looked at him in the dark. We need someone to take Mercer's statement tonight, before he sleeps on it and decides it's not his business. That's my job, Samuel said. Yes, Clara said. Go. He went. She stood outside the saloon in the mountain night and felt the cold and thought about her father and thought about the particular satisfaction of watching a thing you built doing exactly what it was designed to do, and she thought that maybe this was what justice felt like in its earliest stages. Not dramatic, not immediate, but this. A drunk man in a saloon saying too much, a woman drinking coffee 10 feet away, and the whole precarious structure of a corrupt man's careful system developing its first real crack. Samuel was inside for 40 minutes. He came out with a look on his face that she had not seen before. Mercer had a copy of his amended easement, he said. He'd kept it because something bothered him about the language. He didn't know what. He'd been holding on to it for a year and a half, not knowing what it meant. He knows now? Clara said. I told him about Aldrich, Samuel said. About the federal examiner. He wants to file. He's going to Denver next week with his documents. Clara closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. All right, she said. All right. We need to write to Aldrich tonight and tell him about Greer's conversation and about Mercer. We need it in the record that this happened before Greer has a chance to retract or claim he was misunderstood. Tonight? Samuel said. Tonight, Clara said. They rode back to the ranch. They sat down at the desk together. Samuel reading back what he'd heard in the saloon while Clara wrote, her hand moving quickly and precisely across the page, the lamp burning low, the night outside enormous and silent and full of mountains. At some point past midnight, Samuel stopped talking, and she looked up, and he was watching her write with an expression she had no word for. Not love. That word required more certainty than either of them had reached yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man who had spent a long time looking at an empty space in his life and was slowly, carefully, beginning to understand that it might not always be empty. She kept writing. I need to know something, he said. Ask, she said, not looking up. When this is over, he said. When Aldrich has what he needs, and the federal examiner closes the case, and Caldwell faces whatever he faces. What do you want to do? She stopped writing. She looked at him. I told you I hadn't let myself think about that, she said. I'm asking you to start, he said. I'm asking because He stopped. He started again. The ranch needs someone who can manage the accounts, and someone who knows how to deal with legal documents, and someone who can tell the difference between what a paper says and what it means. He paused. I realize that's a very practical way to say something that isn't entirely practical. Clara set down her pen. Samuel, she said. I'm not asking you to answer tonight, he said. I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm just asking you to know that the question is there, that I'm asking it. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said quietly. I hear it. He nodded. She picked up her pen. They worked until the lamp burned low and the letter was finished and sealed. And then Samuel took the night watch because neither of them trusted that Caldwell's men might not make a move now that Greer had been drinking in public. And Clara went to her room and lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time since she'd arrived in Colorado territory, actually imagine a future. Not a vague future. A specific one. This kitchen. this desk, this window facing east. The garden that had been Margaret's and was now, little by little, becoming something else. Not replacing what was there before, but growing alongside it, the way things grow when the soil is good and someone remembers to tend it. She fell asleep thinking about that. She woke at dawn to Samuel's voice outside her door, careful and measured, telling her that a rider had come from town. She was up immediately. The rider was from the general store. Not the same boy as before, an older man this time, someone who delivered goods to the outlying ranches. He had a letter, not from Aldrich, from Edward Caldwell. Samuel read it first. Then he handed it to Clara without a word. She read it. It was not what she expected. It was not a threat. It was not a new offer. It was a request for a meeting. A formal, written request, carefully phrased, asking Samuel to meet with Caldwell at the county courthouse on neutral ground at a time of Samuel's choosing, to discuss a potential resolution to their current disagreement. "He's scared," Clara said. "Greer talked," Samuel said. "Word got back. He needs to know how much we have before he decides what to do next," Clara said. "That's what this meeting is. He's trying to assess the damage." "Should I go?" Samuel said. Clara thought about it carefully. She thought about Aldrich and the Federal Examiner and Mercer's copy of the amended easement sitting in a drawer 2 valleys over. She thought about the letter they'd written last night that was going to Denver today. She thought about the question of whether a meeting with Caldwell at this stage helped them or helped him. "Go," she said, "but I'm coming with you." "Clara, he rejected me at a train station," she said. "He threatened me in your doorway. He built a system designed to strip you of everything you've spent your life building." She met Samuel's eyes. "I want to be in that room." Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then something happened in his face that was very close to a smile. Not the almost smile she'd seen before, but something more definite, something that reached his eyes. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. The meeting was 2 days later. The county courthouse was not Greer's office. Greer, notably, had not been seen at work since the night at the saloon, but a formal meeting room used for mediated disputes, with a table and chairs and a window, and the slightly stale air of a place where a great many difficult conversations had been conducted and absorbed into the walls. Caldwell was already there when they arrived. Howe was alone, which surprised Clara. No Tanner, no hired men. Just Edward Caldwell in his good coat, sitting at one side of the table with his hands folded in front of him and the look of a man who had spent 2 days revising his understanding of the situation and had not enjoyed the process. He looked at Clara when she walked in. She looked back at him. He looked away first. He spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting making the case for a negotiated settlement. He used phrases like mutual benefit and practical resolution and moving forward. The language of a man who wanted to end a thing without naming what the thing was. Samuel let him talk. Clara sat with her hands folded on the table and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who is listening very carefully and finding nothing to agree with. When Caldwell finished, Samuel said, "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing to withdraw the county enforcement order," Caldwell said, "to restore the water routing to its original path, and to make a fair offer on the parcel that's caused all this conflict, the South Pasture acreage, based on current market value." "You're proposing to buy the land you've been trying to take," Samuel said. "I'm proposing to resolve this amicably," Caldwell said. "Mr. Caldwell," Clara said. He looked at her. Her voice was entirely level. "Aldrich's office has identified at minimum 3 properties in this county where easement documents were altered after signing. One of the affected landowners has already begun the process of filing with the Territorial Land Authority. A federal land examiner has been requested." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "The county land clerk's office is currently under administrative review, and I believe you received communication from the Territorial Land Authority's office in Denver approximately 4 days ago." Caldwell's face did not change, but his hands, folded on the table, tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. "I don't know what you think you've—" he started. "Mr. Caldwell," Clara said again, in the same level voice. "I am a woman from a farm in Missouri who spent 6 years reading every legal document that came within reach of her family's land, because her father believed the only defense against dishonesty was understanding. I found the discrepancy in Samuel's easement in 2 hours with a magnifying glass and a lamp. She paused. What do you imagine the federal land examiner is going to find? The room was very quiet. Caldwell looked at her, and in that look, for just a moment before he composed himself, Clara saw it. Not anger, not contempt. Something rarer and, she thought, more useful. Genuine recalibration. The look of a man who had assessed her at a train station and drawn a conclusion, and was now in a courthouse meeting room understanding, with the slow discomfort of forced honesty, exactly how wrong he had been. What do you want? He said. His voice was quieter now. I want what's already in motion, Samuel said. I want the federal inquiry to conclude. I want Aldrich's investigation to run its course. And I want you to understand that the South pasture is not for sale. Not now. Not at any price. Caldwell looked at the table. The inquiry, he said carefully, will be damaging. To more than just my business concerns. I know, Samuel said. Men I've had associations with, Caldwell said. Financial arrangements. If a federal examiner starts pulling threads. That's not my concern, Samuel said. You should have considered that before you started pulling threads of your own. Caldwell was quiet for a long moment. Clara watched him. She watched a man performing, in real time, the calculation of someone who had run out of moves in a game he'd been controlling for 3 years. She watched him arrive, with visible and private reluctance, at the conclusion that there was no play left. I'll withdraw the county order, he said finally. I'll restore the water routing within the week. In writing, Clara said. Filed with the Territorial Land Authority, not the county. He looked at her. In writing, he confirmed. And the properties of the other affected landowners, Clara said. The ones who sold under the impression the altered easements were valid. That's not something I can negotiate for them. But I'd suggest you speak with your attorney about what a voluntary restitution arrangement might mean for your situation versus what a federal determination might mean. Caldwell stared at her. You're very thorough, he said. His voice had an edge in it, but underneath the edge was something that might, in a different man, have been admiration. My father raised me to be, she said. He stood. He was a tall man, and the room felt smaller when he moved in it, and Clara stayed very still and didn't move anything but her eyes, tracking him as he picked up his hat. He stopped at the door. He turned back. He looked at Samuel. Carter, he said, I want you to know what I said at the station. When I turned Miss Whitmore away, he paused, and the pause had the weight of a man choosing words carefully for the first time in a long time. That was a failure of judgment, on my part. Samuel said nothing. Caldwell looked at Clara. I made a decision about your worth in approximately 4 seconds, he said, based on a dress and a suitcase. His jaw worked. I was wrong. Clara looked at him. I know you were, she said. It doesn't require my forgiveness, Mr. Caldwell, but I appreciate you saying it. He left. The door closed. The room was very quiet. Clara sat at the table with her hands still folded in front of her, and she breathed through the next 30 seconds carefully, because 30 seconds was about how long she could keep the composure in place before the reality of what had just happened started to press against the inside of her chest, with something that was partly triumph and partly grief, and mostly just the vast, relieved exhaustion of a person who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been permitted to set it down. Samuel was looking at her. You all right? He said quietly. Yes, she said. Give me a moment. He gave her the moment. Then she stood. She picked up her coat. We need to write to Aldrich, she said. Today. Everything he said in this room, everything he agreed to, needs to be in the record before his attorney has the chance to reframe it. Clara, Samuel said. She stopped. Howe was still sitting at the table, and he was looking at her with that expression, the one that had been building for weeks, the one she had been carefully not examining too directly because she was not yet certain of the ground beneath it. And she thought that today, in this room, after this, she might be ready to look at it properly. "How was wrong?" Samuel said quietly. "About what he saw at that station, the dress, the suitcase." He paused. "I want you to know that what I saw that day, what made me walk over, had nothing to do with what you were carrying. It was how you were standing." Clara looked at him. "How was I standing?" she said. "Like someone who had just had everything go wrong," Samuel said, "and had decided it wasn't going to matter." The courthouse was very still around them. "You thought that was worth walking toward?" she said. "I thought it was the bravest thing I'd seen in years," he said. "I still do." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in Redemption Creek, a horse went past on the road. A door closed. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary day in a small mountain town, continuing its business without any awareness that in the meeting room of its county courthouse, two people were sitting with the evidence of a hard-won thing between them and figuring out, slowly and carefully, what came next. "We should write to Aldrich," Clara said. "We should," Samuel said. "And then," she said, "I'd like to go back to the ranch." "All right," he said. "I want to see how the south pasture is doing," she said. "And I want to check on the sheep trail. And I want to make sure Pete remembered to check the north fence before nightfall." "He did," Samuel said. "I told him before we left." "Good," she said. She moved toward the door. "Clara." She turned back. He had stood. He was holding his hat. He looked, for just this moment, like the man she had first seen on a train platform. Direct, unhurried, present. Except that now she knew who he was, and he knew who she was. And the particular kind of knowing that comes from weeks of shared difficulty and shared work and shared early mornings and shared lamp-lit nights had changed the weight of his gaze entirely. "I asked you what you wanted," he said, "when this was over." "You did," she said. "Do you have an answer yet?" She thought about Missouri. She thought about an empty suitcase with a letter at the bottom of it. She thought about a garden that had been someone else's and was now beginning to be something it hadn't been before, not a replacement, but a continuation. She thought about a kitchen table and a desk covered in documents and 2 tin cups of coffee in the morning, dark, and the mountains pressing enormous and patient against every window. "I'm thinking," she said. "Take your time," he said. She turned back to the door. But she was smiling, and he saw it. She was still smiling when they walked out of the courthouse. She didn't mean to be. It wasn't a decision she made. It simply happened the way some things had been happening lately, without her permission, without her planning, arriving quietly in the middle of ordinary moments and refusing to leave. Samuel noticed. He said nothing. But he walked a little closer to her than usual on the way back to the wagon, and the space between them on the wagon seat on the ride home was different from what it had been 2 months ago when she'd climbed up beside him for the first time, not knowing whether she was making the worst decision of her life. She knew now that she hadn't been. The week after the courthouse meeting moved with the particular speed of things that have been waiting a long time to resolve. True to his word, and Clara suspected true to his attorney's urgent advice, Caldwell filed the withdrawal of the county enforcement order with the Territorial Land Authority in Denver within 4 days. The water rerouting was corrected by the end of the week. She watched from the edge of the south pasture on the morning it happened, standing beside Samuel while 2 of Caldwell's hired men worked on the creek diversion without looking up, and she felt the particular quiet satisfaction of watching something put back the way it was supposed to be. "The grass will take a season to recover," Samuel said. "It'll recover," Clara said. He glanced at her. "You sound certain." "I am," she said. "Things that have good roots come back." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "They do." Aldrich's formal correspondence arrived 10 days after the courthouse meeting. The federal land examiner had been assigned. The investigation into county land office practices was now officially a federal matter, which meant Greer had retained his own attorney and was reportedly cooperating extensively with investigators in hopes of reducing his own exposure, which meant the information flowing into Aldrich's office had accelerated from a trickle to something considerably more substantial. Caldwell's attorney had been in contact with the federal examiner's office. Clara read all of this in Aldrich's careful official language and translated it for Samuel and Hector and Pete around the kitchen table, and what she said was, "It's out of our hands now. We did what we needed to do, and we did it correctly, and the rest is the law's work." "How long?" Hector asked. "Months," Clara said honestly. "These things take time. But the outcome—" She paused. "I feel confident about the outcome." Pete looked at Hector. Hector looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," Hector said carefully, "you've been here 9 weeks." "I know," Clara said. "When you came, I asked you if you were staying a while," he said. "You said you didn't know yet." The kitchen was quiet. Samuel was looking at his coffee cup. "I remember," Clara said. "Do you know yet?" Hector said. He was not being impertinent. His voice had the careful gentleness of a man who had watched his employer survive a great deal of loneliness and was asking the only question that mattered without quite having the authority to ask it directly. Clara looked at Hector. She looked at Pete, who was determinedly examining the table. She looked at Samuel, who had not looked up from his coffee cup, but whose stillness had the particular quality of a man who was listening to every word with his whole body. "I'm working on knowing," Clara said. Hector nodded like that was the right answer. Maybe it was. The letter from her sister arrived 3 days later. She hadn't written to Missouri since she left. Hadn't known what to say. Hadn't wanted to explain the humiliation of the station. Hadn't been ready to describe what had come after, in terms that would make sense to anyone who hadn't lived through it beside her. But she had sent a brief note when they returned from Denver, just enough to say she was safe and well and situated with respectable people. And her sister Ruth had clearly been waiting with considerable impatience for any word at all. Ruth's letter was 3 pages long and covered every emotion from fury at Edward Caldwell to relief that Clara was safe to barely concealed excitement at the mention of a rancher named Samuel Carter, about whom Ruth asked 11 questions in the space of 2 paragraphs, each one more pointed than the last. Clara read it in her room and laughed for the first time in as long as she could remember. It felt strange in her chest. Good strange. The kind of strange that happens when something comes back that you forgot was missing. She wrote back that evening. She told Ruth everything. The station, the platform, the money she'd left in Caldwell's hand, the wagon ride up the mountain. She told her about the ledger and the document and the trip to Denver and the courthouse meeting. She told her about Hector and Pete and the south pasture and the old sheep trail they'd cleared. She wrote about Samuel last. She chose each word with the care of a woman who knew her sister would read between every line, and she tried to write in a way that was true without being more than she had yet said to him directly. She wrote, "He is a man who waited until I'd had my first few minutes of hard news before he walked over, because he thought I had a right to them. I have not met many people who thought that way. I find I am thinking about it more than I expected to." She sealed the letter. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it with the outgoing mail and went back to the kitchen and started the fire for supper. Samuel came in from the barn an hour later to find her cooking, and the table set, and the lamp lit, and the room warm, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way he sometimes did. Not dramatically, just pausing, like a man taking stock of something he was still getting used to. Before he came in and washed his hands and sat down. "Let her go out?" he asked. "With the afternoon rider," she said. "Your sister?" "My sister," she confirmed. She had opinions. "About?" Clara glanced at him. "About everything," she said. He almost smiled. They ate. The comfortable silence between them had become a different thing over the weeks. Not empty, not avoidant, but full in the way that silence gets full when 2 people know each other well enough that words are an option rather than a requirement. She had noticed this about him early. He did not fill space with noise. He waited until he had something worth saying. She had spent her whole life surrounded by people who talked to avoid thinking, and she had not understood until Samuel how restful the alternative was. "I want to ask you something," he said, after a while. "Then ask," she said. "The garden," he said. "You've been working it every morning." She looked at him. "Yes," she said carefully. "Margaret's seeds are still in the tin in the second shelf of the pantry," he said. His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it. Not pain exactly, but the proximity of it, the way you can feel weather before it arrives. I haven't touched it. I don't know if you knew. I found it 3 weeks ago, Clara said. I left it. Why? She set down her fork. Because it wasn't mine to open, she said. Not until I knew whether I was staying. And because even if I do stay. She paused, finding the words. What was hers doesn't have to become mine. It can just be hers. That's allowed. Samuel looked at her across the table. Something moved through his face that was not grief and not relief, but some compound of both. The expression of a man who had been carrying a particular weight so carefully for so long that the moment someone acknowledged it without trying to take it from him or dismiss it, the acknowledgement itself was almost more than he knew what to do with. She would have liked you, he said quietly. I think I would have liked her, Clara said. He nodded once. The seeds are good for planting, he said. Some of them. She kept them properly. A pause. If you wanted to use them, that's your decision, not mine. Clara looked at him. She understood what he was saying, not just about seeds. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, he said. They cleaned up together after supper. The easy, familiar routine of it, him drying what she washed, both of them moving around each other in the small kitchen without collision, without negotiation, with the practiced comfort of people who have shared a space long enough that the choreography has become instinctive. He hung the cloth on the hook. He turned. She was right there, closer than she'd realized, the kitchen being what it was, small and warm and lit amber by the lamp. And for a moment, neither of them moved. Clara, he said. Samuel, she said. His voice, when it came, was the quietest she'd ever heard it. I want to ask you to stay. Not because the ranch needs your help with the accounts. Not because you're useful in a legal office. Not because of anything practical. He stopped. Because when I come in from the barn in the morning, I look for you. Because when something happens that I need to think through, your voice is the one I hear in my head working through it. Because the house, he paused. The house sounds different when you're in it. And I had forgotten that houses were supposed to sound like something. Clara did not look away from him. She had been a careful woman for a long time. Careful with her hopes. Careful with her heart. Careful with the particular kind of trust that, once broken, took years to rebuild. She had been careful because careful was what kept you standing when everything else fell. But careful had its limits, and this man had walked toward her on a platform when everyone else was walking past, and had offered her a room with a lock on the inside, and had given her the floor in a government office, and stood at her shoulder without making it about him, and had told her about Margaret without being asked, and without performing his grief, and had said I wanted to see how you handled it before I decided whether to say anything. And she had been thinking about that sentence, with its patience and its respect, for 9 weeks. I'm not going back to Missouri, she said. He looked at her. I haven't been planning to go back to Missouri for a while now, she said. I just wasn't sure how to say that without making it mean more than you were ready for it to mean. And now? He said. She looked at him steadily. Ask me properly, she said. Something shifted in his face. Surprise, and then something warmer than surprise, and then the almost smile that she had catalogued so many iterations of over the past weeks resolved, finally and completely, into an actual smile. Full and unguarded and genuine. The kind that changed his whole face, the kind she suspected Margaret had seen often, and that the ranch hands had not seen in years. He reached out and took her hand. He held it the way a careful man holds something he values, firmly, without clutching. Clara Whitmore, he said. Will you stay? Not for the season. Not until something better comes along. Will you stay and make this home yours, and let me make it worth staying for? She felt the question settle into her chest. She thought about the letter at the bottom of her suitcase. She thought about a train platform in the mountain heat, and a man who walked toward her with his hat in his hand and nothing to offer except honesty. She thought about 6 years of being the person who held everything together for everyone else, and about what it felt like to have someone, finally, hold something together for her. Not by rescuing her, Not by deciding her worth for her, but by standing beside her in a government office and letting her speak and being there when she came out. "Yes," she said. Just that. One word. But it had the weight of everything she'd carried to get to it. His hand tightened around hers. The lamp burned. The mountains pressed close and quiet outside. The morning after that conversation, Clara opened the tin of seeds. She did it alone, in the early light before Samuel was up, sitting at the kitchen table with the tin in her hands, and the patience of a woman who understood that some things required a private moment before they could become a shared one. She opened the lid and looked at what Margaret had kept. Small paper envelopes, each labeled in a neat hand, each folded precisely at the corners, the way a careful person folds things they intend to return to. Tomatoes, beans, lavender. A variety of squash Clara didn't recognize. And at the bottom, tucked underneath the others, a seed envelope labeled in the same neat hand, "For whoever tends this next." Clara stared at that for a long time. She did not know if Margaret had written it, knowing she was dying. She did not know if it was written in hope or resignation, or simple practicality, or something in between. But it was there, and it was clear, and it was the most generous thing Clara had ever seen. A woman leaving a door open for someone she would never meet. She closed the tin carefully. She held it against her chest for a moment. Then she set it on the windowsill, where the morning light came in clean and clear and eastern, and she started the fire and put the coffee on and began the day. Samuel found the tin on the windowsill when he came in. He stood very still for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. She was at the stove with her back to him, but she felt his gaze, and she said, without turning, "I thought it could sit there for now, until I'm ready to plant." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. His voice had something in it that she had no name for and didn't need one. He sat down. She poured the coffee. They were at the table when Hector came in with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that was trying very hard not to be a grin, and mostly failing. "Something happen?" Samuel said. "Letter from town," Hector said, handing it over. "From the county administrative office. Official letterhead." Samuel looked at Clara. She nodded. He opened it. He read it. His expression went through several things quickly. Surprise, then something harder to name, then a kind of quiet settlement, like a man watching the last piece of something fall into place. He handed the letter to Clara. She read it. Reginald Greer, county land clerk, had tendered his resignation the previous Thursday. The county administrative office was conducting an internal review of all documents filed through his office in the past 6 years. Any party with concerns about the validity of filed documents in the county land record was invited to submit a formal inquiry. 6 years, Clara said. "He's been doing it for 6 years, Samuel said. "Longer than he was doing it to you," she said. "And how many ranches has Caldwell picked up in 6 years?" Samuel said. Not a question. The weight of it in his voice. "Aldrich's examiner will answer that," Clara said. "It's not our job anymore." She folded the letter. "Our job is the south pasture and the sheep trail and the cattle drive in 3 weeks." Hector did grin now, fully, without apology. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "The cattle drive happened on a Tuesday in late September, 3 weeks and 2 days after the courthouse meeting. And it went without incident down the cleared sheep trail under a sky that had finally made up its mind about autumn and was delivering it in the particular mountain way, sharp and blue and absolute, the kind of weather that made everything look decided. Clara rode beside Samuel for the first time. She had not ridden much. Missouri farm girls walked more than they rode. But Samuel had been quietly patient about teaching her, and she had been quietly determined about learning. And the result was that she sat her horse with a competence that was not yet grace, but was headed in that direction. Hector gave no indication that he noticed anything different about the morning. But she caught him smiling to himself 3 times before noon. That evening, back at the ranch with the cattle counted and settled and the paperwork complete, Samuel built a fire in the yard because the nights had gone cold, and it was the kind of evening that wanted a fire, and they sat around it, all 4 of them, Samuel and Clara, and Hector and Pete, with coffee and the specific companionable exhaustion of people who have done a hard thing well together. Pete, who was 17 and still learning the relationship between what he thought and what he should say out loud, looked at Clara across the fire and said, "Miss Whitmore, are you going to be here next spring?" Hector closed his eyes briefly. Samuel looked at the fire. Clara looked at Pete with the full, level attention she had previously deployed on county land clerks and territorial officials. And Pete went slightly pink and said, "I just meant for the planting season. Because Hector said you know about gardens, and we haven't had a proper kitchen garden in—" "Pete," Samuel said. "No," Clara said. "Let him finish." Pete looked at her cautiously. "I just think it'd be good," he said, with the earnest simplicity of someone who has run out of ways to complicate a true thing. "For the ranch. For everyone. If you were here next spring." Clara looked at the fire for a moment. She thought about a seed envelope at the bottom of a tin, labeled in a hand that was not hers, "For whoever tends this next." "I'll be here next spring," she said. Pete exhaled. Hector opened his eyes. Samuel said nothing, but his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, moved just slightly toward hers in the dark beside the fire, and she turned her hand over, and his fingers closed around it, and neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing to say that the gesture hadn't already said more clearly. The fire burned. The mountains held the cold and the dark around their small circle of warmth. Somewhere below, on the valley road, a night rider passed, and then was gone, and the silence came back enormous and familiar and no longer empty. A month after that evening, Dan Mercer rode up to the ranch on a gray morning with his amended easement document and his 3-year-old Anger and his new attorney from Denver, and he sat at Clara's kitchen table and drank her coffee and told her that 2 other ranchers in the next valley had come forward with similar documents after word spread about the federal inquiry, and that Aldrich's examiner had now formally identified 7 properties affected by the Meridian Trust's document fraud scheme, and that Edward Caldwell had been served with a federal notice of civil liability the previous Thursday. Clara sat across from Dan Mercer and listened to all of this. When he finished, he said, "I want you to know something, Miss Whitmore. When Carter told me about you, what you did with that easement document, how you found it, I want you to know that I've been carrying that altered paper for a year and a half, not knowing what I was looking at, thinking I'd been stupid, thinking I should have caught it myself." He paused. "What you did, finding it, knowing what it meant, knowing what to do with it, that gave the rest of us a way back, a way to fight." He looked at her directly. "I don't know how to thank you properly for that." Clara shook her head. "Thank my father," she said. "He's the one who taught me to read the fine print." Mercer stayed for another hour, and then rode back down the mountain, and Clara sat for a while after he left in the quiet kitchen with her cold coffee and the morning light coming through the eastern window and the tin of seeds on the windowsill where it had been sitting for 4 weeks. She looked at the tin for a long time. Then she got up. She took her coat from the hook. She took the tin from the windowsill. She went out to the garden. The ground was cold, but not frozen. They had another few weeks before hard frost, she thought, and there were things that could still go in before winter, things that would wait under the cold earth and come up in spring without needing to be told to. She opened the tin. She found the packet labeled, "For whoever tends this next." She opened it. She knelt down in the cold garden dirt in her good coat, like a woman who had decided that some things were worth the indignity of kneeling, and she pressed the seeds into the ground one by one, in a row, with the particular care of someone doing something for the first time that they intend to do many times more. Samuel found her there 10 minutes later. He stood at the edge of the garden. He saw the tin. He saw the open packet. He did not say anything for a moment. "You could have waited for better weather," he said finally. "I could have," she agreed, "but I didn't want to wait anymore." He came and crouched down beside her. He picked up a handful of the cold soil and let it fall through his fingers, the way a man does who knows his land. "Good soil," he said. "Yes," she said. "Things will grow." "Yes," she said. "They will." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara." I want to marry you," he said. "I've been wanting to say it plainly for about 3 weeks, and I keep finding reasons to wait, and I've decided the reasons aren't better than the saying." She sat back on her heels. She looked at him. He was looking at her with his direct, unhurried gaze. The gaze she had catalogued on a train platform before she knew his name. The gaze that had decided she was worth walking toward before it knew anything else about her. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "All right, I'll marry you," she said. "Did you want a longer answer?" Something broke open in his face. Not the almost smile, not the careful measured almost, but the full thing, unguarded and genuine, and lit from somewhere deeper than his expression. "No," he said. "That's the right length." He reached over and covered her hands, cold from the soil, cold from the autumn air, with both of his, and held them until they were warm. They stayed in the garden a while longer. The sky above the mountains was the particular blue of late September in Colorado, high and absolute and enduring, the kind of blue that makes you understand why people stayed in places that were hard to live in, because the world could be that beautiful if you were in the right place to see it. Below them, the south pasture was recovering. The water was running where it was supposed to run. The sheep trail they had cleared together was wide enough now that the cattle moved through it easily, and come spring, it would be wider still. In 3 months, Caldwell's civil liability case would begin its slow federal progress through the courts, and Greer would testify extensively in exchange for a reduced sentence, and 6 of the 7 affected ranchers would receive formal settlements, and the Meridian Land and Cattle Trust would be dissolved, and the land it had taken by fraud would begin its own slow process of returning to the people it had been taken from. In 4 months, Clara Whitmore would stand in the small church in Redemption Creek in the only good dress she had brought from Missouri, and Dan Mercer would sit in the second pew, and Hector would stand up with Samuel, and Pete would forget he wasn't supposed to cry, and would spend the entire ceremony pretending he had something in his eye, and the minister would say the words, and Samuel would say his words, and Clara would say hers, and the town that had watched a woman be turned away on a platform on a summer afternoon would watch her choose to stay on a cold October morning, and some of them, the ones worth counting, would understand that they were watching the same courage twice. In spring, the seeds would come up, all of them, including the ones labeled "for whoever tends this next," which would grow into something neither Clara nor Margaret could have predicted, but which would bloom in the mountain summer with a persistence that impressed even the ranch hands, who were not by nature sentimental men, but who found themselves, on certain mornings, standing at the edge of that garden and not quite walking away. But that was all still ahead of them. Right now, there was just the garden and the cold soil, and the 2 of them crouched in it in the morning light, and Samuel's hands around Clara's, and the mountains holding everything in the way mountains do, patient and enormous, and completely indifferent to how long anything took, because they had seen enough to know that the things worth having were worth the wait. The woman who had arrived with nothing had found a mountain cowboy who saw everything she was worth, and she had looked back at him and seen the same. That was the beginning of all the rest of it, and the rest of it was home.